can start now.
Okay, you're good.
All right.
All right then. So the regular session of Measure LC Citizens Oversight Committee will please come to order. The meeting is being conducted telephonically, virtually, pursuant to Governor Order N 29-20. Because this is a telephonic meeting, all votes would be taken by roll call. So may we have the roll call, please?
Committee members Yeager,
Here.
committee member Gomez,
Absent.
committee member Harvey,
Present.
vice chair Sison,
Present.
chair Vos.
I'm here. Thank
We have
you.
a quorum.
Thank you. So it'd be appropriate to have a motion to excuse member Gomez. Someone please make that motion.
I make a motion to excuse member Gomez from the March 31st second meeting.
And I second that.
Thank you. Any discussion? Please call the roll.
Committee members Yeager,
Present.
Harvey,
Yes.
vice chair Sison,
Present.
chair Vos.
Yes.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Yeah, the motion was to excuse member Gomez. I'll offer the invocation tonight, so shall we all pray together? We honor and pray for those serving members of the armed forces and veterans. We remember and are grateful for those who have served, and especially those who sacrificed their life and injury for the freedoms we all enjoy in this great country. We also pray for our community, our first responders, and all those who have provided medical care and pandemic support during this most challenging time. Father God, we humbly ask for your help and for your guidance in identifying the problems we can rectify in our community. Guide us in our efforts to fairly administer the Oversight Committee's objectives. Help us use our time and energy wisely, not to waste it on insignificant matters that benefit no one. Please bless us all to your service. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
All right, we have presentation number 2 tonight.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Vos. Tonight we're going to go over, it's going to be the George show. So we talked about the details of the money. He likes it when I say that. He likes it when it's all about him.
No, I don't.
So he'll be talking in detail about the amount, the numbers of the budget, things of that nature. You asked some questions last week about debt service and things like that. So he'll be covering the details of that. The hope is we get through this, we'll have a little break, and then staff will start working the budget a little bit, coming back to you with recommendations. So we have kind of the talking points to go from, and then we can move on from there to in the middle of the budget process, probably sometime middle April, late April, to come back here with some recommendations or some thoughts from city staff perspective. But with that, I will turn it over to George, and he can walk you through the process. Again, this is a very detailed overview. I mean, I don't want to say we're going to go through it quickly, but if there's any questions or comments or thoughts, please don't, keep it informal and jump in whenever you want to ask questions.
All right, very good, thank you.
And I'll just preface that with, I'm only dealing with one screen. If I were in the office, I'd have one screen with the presentation and all your beautiful faces on the other. So I can actually see your faces if you have a question. So I'll be able to hear you, but I won't be able to see you. So if you have a question, just speak up and I'll pause. All right, so with that, so tonight we have part 2 of the 2-part presentation. As I sold it last week that we would be spending tonight primarily on kind of the city's financials, budget process, amounts, taking a little time to talk about the tax, as well as answer some of the questions that you had brought up last week, specifically in regards to pensions, debt service, and the actual budget process and assumptions that we use when putting the budget together. So with that, we'll get right into it. I want to start with going over what we use as kind of our big picture of assumptions. And so this has kind of been a theme of mine as we go into any budget cycle, is to create some assumptions that as we are making decisions and as we are putting together the actual numbers, that there are some real drivers that are directing those decisions. And this year, for the budget cycle that we're in currently, fiscal year budget 20/21, those budget assumptions were as follows. So we were at this time, and you got to think back at where we were when this budget was adopted back in May and June of 2020. The first budget assumption is to remain cautiously optimistic. We were not exactly sure how COVID would impact the financials. We know better now, as we've gotten half a year's of activity in the books, and so we were able to make some budget adjustments at mid-year to reflect the true impact of COVID, which was not as bad as previously estimated. The balancing act with every budget, we want to balance or better, and so I like to say balance or better is in that we want to make sure that the money we're bringing in greater or equal than the money we're spending in any given year, with the exception of project work that may take more than a couple of years to spend. Projects. So if you've been a part of the city of Lancaster for some time, you understand that they're very project and capital improvement centric. We have a substantial amount of special revenues that come into the city to help in that regard. Ideally, there's always been and has generally been a focus in Lancaster on projects. So this year, we approved the budget with about $100 million worth of capital projects built into it, and then we're working through those projects on a day-to-day basis as you see activity happening throughout the community. And then the available resources to sustain the special revenue and the enterprise fund activity. So that's making sure that not just our general fund has enough money to do what it needs to do, but making sure that all the fiduciary responsibilities and enterprise responsibilities they have are solvent as well. So when we talk, nobody really truly understands until they get involved in my department as to how the funds are set up and how money is organized in a city. If you go into a school district, they may have 3 or 4 of these. If you go into a special district, you may have 1 of these, one fund, where everything's just managed out of the one fund. They may have a separate project fund, but this is the city of Lancaster's fund descriptions and how we actually organize our money. The majority of the activity in the general fund takes place in the general fund, of course, and that's where our capital reserves. So when I start talking capital reserves, general fund reserves, that they're all organized in those first 3 funds, the Fund 101, 104, and 109. All those 3 funds represent your general fund activity. Measure LC is a general fund revenue. So as we go on through the presentation, if you notice a lot of the attention that I spend is on the general fund, is because the majority of the activities where we'll utilize the funding from Measure LC will be general fund related. Then you go through and you see special revenue funds, and we have, if you can name it, there's a special revenue fund for it. And really the special revenue funds are separated and segregated from the general fund with intent and with compliance, through compliance that we have to have in order to receive those revenues. We're required to segregate those revenues and track their expenditures separately. A lot of those special funds are transportation specific, starting with gas tax, Prop 1B, measures R&M, Prop C, Prop 42 congestion management. These are all special revenues that come in that require the segregation. We have a county-wide park fund and Measure A. We have a variety of grant funds. There are 11 different grant funds. Community HUD-related grant funds. We actually have 3 funds just related specifically to HUD grants. Then we have our Air Quality Management Fund, Fund 204. And so you just kind of, this was to give you an understanding of all of the different funds that the finance department manages. But generally, we're going to be talking about the general fund. Also, on the right side of the form, I'm going to make some reference later on to internal service funds, and that those are the 3 new funds that we're going to create for the next budget cycle to accommodate and track the fleet maintenance activities, information technology activities, and your general liability, which are general litigation activities. Those are all be tracked separate in their own fund and then allocated because they actually serve more than just the general fund. Right now, they're all combined in the general fund. And so by segregating them out into their own fund, they can appropriately spread their cost to the appropriate funds that require their services. So in short, fleet maintenance services more vehicles in some of the special revenue funds than it does the general fund. So the fleet maintenance fund will appropriately charge those funds as an internal service funds, as opposed to having those activities tracked solely in the general fund. After mid-year, we reconciled the list of changes as we knew more about COVID, resulting in, we started with a $74 million budget in the beginning, and at mid-year we adjusted budget up on the revenue side to $81.4 million. Of that amount, $50.8 million comes in by way of taxes, 29 comes in by way of others, and then 1.1 comes by way of transfer from other funds, and we'll get into the details here. The general fund revenue, majority of it is sales tax, and this is not including yet the Measure LC for next year. So remember, this is the current year. And so sales tax still serves as our #1 general fund revenue, followed there by property tax, the other taxes that we'll list here on the next sheet, and then reimbursement, service charges for service in our recreational programs, and therefore. Of the taxes we do collect, this is a breakdown of them. So on property taxes, we get it from property tax ad valorem tax, which is the 1% that you pay on your property tax. The city receives about $6 million. If you recall, in last week's presentation, Jason gave the example of the property tax payment that you would make and the amount that the city actually receives from that. In aggregate, the city receives about $6 million a year in property tax. Then we have a property transfer tax. That's the tax that's paid when a property is transferred from one owner to another. It's a one-time fee that's paid at the time of that transaction, and we get about $600,000 a year in that amount. Then we have the property tax in lieu of VLF amount. That it's a long story, and I can get into it if anyone asks. But back when Gray Davis increased the vehicle license fees, and he was recalled, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who owned probably 15 Hummers at the time and didn't want to pay the triple VLF fees, reversed Governor Davis's action to increase vehicle license fees. And in replace of that revenue to cities, he kicked down property tax that had been collected and was accumulating. So now, rather than receiving the full triple amount that we would have in the vehicle license fee, since then we have been receiving property tax in lieu of VLF, and that brings in about $16.5 million a year. And then you have your transient occupancy tax, which is about $1.8 million. That's your hotel tax. And then below that, you have your sales tax. We receive about $23 million in general sales tax, which represents 1% of the 7.25% that's charged on the base Bradley Burns sales tax formula. And I have a slide that breaks that down for you so you can see what that means. And then estimated for the current year, about 1/4's worth of Measure LC, which is about $3 million, which is built in, was added at mid-year as an expectation of revenue. Other general fund revenue types include the vehicle license fees that we do receive, state mandated cost reimbursements, licenses and permits that are required of our customers to pay. our franchise fees that we receive from those providers that benefit from the use of our right of way. So that would include Edison, the gas company, the cable franchises, telephone companies, and the like. They all pay for a franchise fee for the right to actually do business in our right of way to deliver their product. Charges for current services, which is your building permit fee or your building permit fees, other fees being paid to the city, including parks and recs and so forth, fines and forfeitures, grants, and then the parks and recs program fees, which are there as well. So you have, I don't mean to confuse the charges for current services for the parks and recs, because we did break that out, is a significant number, but the charges for current services do have its own category.
So George,
Yes, sir.
Go back to the other slide, would you? Back up one. So fee for service is basically all the licenses, permits, the capitalization fees and so forth for development, all flow into the general fund. So they're accounted for separately, but they can be allocated and spent for other than what they were collected for?
That is correct. Generally, though, if you were to compare the expenses for those departments, it usually runs pretty one for one, because the activities are the planning department, all those expenses are actually captured in there as well. But building permit fees do themselves, as building permit fees are adopted by resolution and are
Right.
as you know, updated annually. That does serve as a general revenue for the city.
Well, your capitalization fees, because that's what I'm assuming your license and permit category and includes. I don't know if it is or not, but we the city, we collect substantial amounts of money in cap fees, and that all flows into the general fund, right?
That's correct. That is correct. Now we have user fees that are very specific to the service that's providing or the cost of the service that's being provided. So that would be captured into charges for current services. And so if you, for example, have the cost of the planner to review the documents itself, that's a general fund revenue, but it's also tied then to the expense of providing the service of doing that plan check and review. And so those are more closely related revenue to expense. But you're right, the capitalization fees and the building permit fees are considered general revenues.
And they can be allocated and spent on other than what they were collected for. For instance, if you have a cap fee for flood control.
No, that's different. Okay, so what you're talking about are development impact fees. So those development impact fees are very specific to the use that you're collecting them, and they're tracked in a different fund. So if it wants a building permit, so if you look at a list of fees that's being charged to a developer for a project per unit, the building permit fee itself is general fund. But when you get into the development impact fee portion of their bill, those are all tracked individually for the purpose that they're collected. And if you bear with me, I'll go back to that slide. If you look at the developer impact fee funds in that third column, so from fund 213 down to 233, so that's where we actually track all the developer impact fees, and they must be spent on their intended purpose.
So there's no mixing and matching with those fees.
No, they must be spent, and there's actually the government code 66,000 mandates that those funds be spent and tracked and reported upon, actually within 5 years of being received. And so there's a lot more restrictions on the use of those funds and the timing of the use of those funds when compared to the other revenues that are collected inside the general fund.
So George,
I would add too, you can spend general fund money on those items, but you can't spend those funds on general fund items. Does that make sense? So if the committee said, hey, drainage is important, we could use these general funds to impact the drainage function, but you couldn't use drainage funds to help pay for cops, for example. So you can go, general fund can go to all these funds, but these funds can't go to the general fund.
Correct.
in the method of calculating the fee requirements, whatever those assessments are, what they must justify the actual expense of the service you intend to provide for the fees you pay.
Correct. And so the actual legal term for that is reasonable relationship. So you must have and establish a nexus or a reasonable relationship between the fee that you're charging and the actual use of those fees.
Right.
And so it actually will come down to, for example, a list of projects that you've identified that will be funded specifically and with costs associated with them to determine the fee amounts.
So George, so of the 45 accounts here, so you can, so in your position, chapter and verse on every single one of those categories, you have to know, you or subordinates have to know how to manage those and what restrictions and controls you must oversight on on all of these categories.
Exactly.
Right?
That is very true. That is very true. So we have, now fortunately, I've done it for more than a few years. And so I've had pretty good experience with those statewide revenues and development impact fees. My first project as a finance employee was to actually complete a development impact fee strategy and study. That was 17, 18 years ago. And so, yeah, so over time, you find it, your world of knowledge becomes pretty finite as you get to understand each and every single one of these and how they work.
And then ultimately, all of this is audited annually.
That is correct. So not only is everything audited by our own internal auditors, a lot of the grant funds will actually send out auditors to make sure that the funds were used. So for example, anything relating to SB 5 and gas tax revenues, the state will actually send an auditor every year to actually audit our use of the gas tax funds. On the developer impact fees, it's a little bit looser. Our internal auditors will evaluate the appropriate uses of those funds as they evaluate the actual individual transactions. But any developer, per state code, any developer can actually show up and initiate an audit or a review of the use of those funds because the developers are the ones that pay them. It's up to them. Well, they have the right and the ability to come and request an audit of the use of those funds to make sure it was done appropriately, or we may have to refund that money back to the developer. So we make sure that we monitor that all very closely.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, so sales tax. Sales tax is the largest single revenue source, and once we include Measure LC, you put those two numbers together, it's really going to be the largest amount of individual revenue that's coming to the general fund at the POS, at the point of sale. And so the intent of this slide is to kind of break down to make sure that we're not confusing what sales tax percentages are, because oftentimes we'll say the city gets 1%. It's not 1% of 100%. It's 1% when you calculate the total amount. So I wanted to take this time and actually kind of explain how this works and how when you go to buy something, or in Commissioner or Committee Member Yeager's case, you go to Toyota, you buy a car, and all they see is that 10.25 that they're putting on that car's bill. Where's that money going? And so I want to make sure this is not hidden knowledge, but it's not widely known how that sales tax number gets broken down. So I wanted to spend some time on that here today. And so so you have the base sales tax agreement. So once you incorporate as a city in the state of California, the California State Code allocates you your share of what they call the Bradley-Burns sales tax. And that Bradley-Burns sales tax is calculated at 7.25. So if you're in an area that has not passed any local taxes that increase above the certain percentage or above the base, your sales tax rate is that 7.25. So of that 7.25, the state general fund receives 5%. The the state of California, I was very clear on what organization is actually, what government entity is actually receiving the funds. The local public safety fund gets a 0.5%. The California Local Health and Social Services gets another 0.5%. And then the county of Los Angeles receives a 0.25% out of that base from the state. So that's collected in the base 7.25, and then the city only gets 1%. You see that there? If it's in the county area, so if we're in non-incorporated areas in the county of LA, then that 1% that the city would normally get goes actually to the county. So the county will receive that 1% in those areas that they still manage. Above the 7.25, and especially here in LA, because LA does have the highest sales tax percentages in the state. Above that, the Los Angeles Transportation Commission had a voter approved 1%. LA County Measure H, the homelessness program, collects another 0.25%, which the city does receive some bit of an allocation. Measures R and M are 0.5% each, which the city does receive a share of those revenues. And then you'll see the 0.75% increase that starts tomorrow here in Lancaster, that will come to the general fund here in Lancaster for that. And so that all adds up to our total of 10.25, which will be collected here locally. Forecasting, a quick forecast of those revenues. We expect 1/4 of receipts for the current year, about $3 million or so. And then right now we are still waiting for our consultant to update our numbers as their original estimate during the start of COVID. They originally estimated we would receive about 12.8 million. Latest increase or latest expectations expect that amount to go up closer to 16 million in our first year. But I'm waiting for them to really prove to me that that's the case before I share an exact figure. Once again, it's always going to be projections, is usually never to the penny, because they really can't anticipate how people are going to go into 7-Eleven and buy gas, right? So, or go to the various stores, how many cars are going to be sold there. It's all projections. And
George, I have good news.
Yes. Because
everyone is sick of being inside. There's going to be a lot of moving about and going out and buying and spending. That's my
correct. I just want them to do it in Lancaster.
Of course.
That's funny. I was on a call with Jason earlier, and he might chime in. I said, for every $1 that Disneyland doesn't get during this season, like this weekend in particular, because this is a big, holiday Disneyland weekend, that money's being spent at home, right? They're spending that on home entertainment, and so are very close to home entertainment. So the good news is they're not Disneyland. It kind of stinks for Anaheim, but the end result is that you'll actually see spikes in our revenue for some of that money that they would be spending.
Me for one. So
yeah, to clarify, George said they're buying a lot of toilet paper.
Well, that too.
Yeah. So for every trip to them they're not taking, that's a jumbo pack of toilet paper that they had to stand in line for.
Did you see me at Costco today or something? Because I swear to God, I just bought a big thing of toilet paper.
It's just a very popular example I could use nowadays because it's so silly and obvious. But yes, so moving on. So when you look at so the big number, when you look at all of our funds, you look at all of our activity, it's about 294 million that we collect and spend on an annual basis. Looking at the breakdown of the general fund, the majority of the general fund cost is our sheriff's contract. That represents about 38% of that, 84 million. Personnel is about 33%. And then you have a variety of other contracts and so forth that represent operations and maintenance, 28%.
How many full-time equivalent employees does the city
we are
have?
right at, I want to say we're at 400, just over 400, 412 maybe. All right, I'll get you the exact number because I know that after mid-year there were no adjustments. I was expecting some, but then I know that we have some plans for next year. So as we actually refine the number, we'll be this next budget cycle will give us a few more as we implement a couple of programs, but I thought we were at 411 or 412.
That's permanent employees. I think it's around 240, George.
240. Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm counting part-timers in there. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So full-timers, we have, that number that Jason, 240.
So you have, but a full-time equivalent is, you have part-timers, you have summer people, you've got all sorts of different categories, right?
Right. And this year was a challenge too, because a lot of our pools were closed that were typically part-timers. So we're in flux over this last couple of years, but that changes regularly depending on season.
Right.
Are you still in the position where you haven't laid anybody off? And I've noticed you also have been advertising opportunities for employment.
Correct. We didn't go through any layoffs other than no permanent or full-time layoffs. And we have been filling positions when necessary. I think generally, I would say, especially now with some additional, responsibilities, we're probably right staffed, if not understaffed.
All right, thank you.
I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for the confusion. I was looking at total bodies, which our payroll handles. The full-time equivalence is 240. All right. Capital improvements. These are capital improvement projects that are already happening without Measure LC. So there are substantial amount of revenues when we looked at that list of special revenue funds that are there to actually help sustain the continuation of our capital improvement program budget and activities, which this year was $100 million. And so we actually have a really robust program. There's a lot going into it. There's a lot of details. If you want to get into more of those details, we can actually get you a lot of that information later. For the purposes of tonight, I just want to kind of put that $100 million number out there, just let you know the gravity of how much is going on, and that so far we've been able to continue a lot of capital improvement programs and projects without the need for Measure LC. So because there are revenues that we've received specifically for those opportunities. Here we're going to talk about reserves. It came up, I think it came up last week, but it's something that we've been trying to hone in on and work on. The general fund reserve policy as it's written now is fairly vague in that it was not vague, it's very specifically says 10% of your revenues will be set aside as reserves. But we're currently at closer to 40% of our revenues as we've been able to build the reserves over the years. And so there is a proposal that I've gone over with Jason that's coming out of my office this year to actually add some construct to the actual reserves themselves and make sure that we're, one, being responsible, and two, actually setting an amount of reserves that's appropriate, depending on who you ask, and it's about half a dozen on one side and 6 on the other. In regards to reserves, some people think that if you have too many reserves, you're not being responsible with funds and getting that money into the streets and building stuff and maintaining stuff appropriately. And if you have too little reserves, then you're not preparing adequately and you're not practicing fiscal management appropriately. So there's that fine mix. I'm proposing that we create a few layers of reserves for specific purposes. We establish reserves for our internal service fund activities. And then as money comes in surplus, we get that money to work. Currently, and so this is going to be my proposal. Jason and I discussed it this morning. It'll be part of the budget package this year to establish reserves in these categories. And so it's kind of, you guys are getting the first look at the proposal other than Jason just over the last couple of days. But ideally, in the general fund reserve is going to be comprised of 3 layers. The first layer is our working capital reserves. As we look at revenues and expenditures and how we actually receive and spend them, our expenditures come in regularly in pretty regular 1/12 chunks every month. Right? If you were to take your total expenditure list and divide it by 12, that's about how we spend our money in the general fund, because it's for payroll and for the sheriff contract, right? And then we have monthly agreements on everything else. Revenues don't necessarily come in that same manner. The bulk of our property tax So the categories that I showed you, where we have property tax and we had the vehicle fee in lieu property tax, we receive those monies twice a year in January and in April. Because when do you pay your property tax bill? You pay your property tax bill in December and in March, right? Or is it May? Yeah. And so when you have a large chunk of your revenue that you're receiving in the last 6 months of the year, but you're spending your money regularly on an even basis month to month, you have a funding gap, a temporary funding gap that exists between the months of October and December, where you are actually spending more than you're bringing in.
That assumes the state continues to fund based on those calendar designations. So you've got to manage your cash flow adequately to be able, and suggesting on top of that, identified reserves that then take specific council action to spend them.
Correct. And so I'm glad you and I are seeing eye to eye so far in this explanation.
I don't make those decisions.
Right. But that working capital reserve is managing that cash flow. So we will maintain 10% of our reserves to solely be to provide us the cash flow for those first 6 months until we start getting the revenue that would start in January, and then it will all reconcile and replenish itself by year end.
So it's sort of a contingency in a sense too.
Well, it's actually really not, because when you look at how the cash flows trend, you have a cash gap in those first 6 months. It happens every single year. And so by actually organizing your reserves to where the floor of your reserves is the amount of that gap, then you're adequately managing your cash flow to not need the general fund to actually borrow cash from other funds to get through those first 6 months. That makes sense? And so ideally, and then by year end, the revenues catch up and you replenish that reserves. You replenish that cash so that you're ready, that same cash, that same cycle of money is ready to be used in the next fiscal year.
So in the school district side, we call it trends. So
yeah.
Right.
Yep. So this is a continuing trend that has continued for my entire career. And some cities don't realize that by only having a 10% reserve, that from on a cash basis in your first 6 months, you're actually using your 10% reserve just to pay the bills. And so if you were to have a large project, right? So let's just say the transportation fund or your Measure R fund or one of your capital improvement funds actually goes out and pays for a large project during that same time frame, you actually, because you're spending their cash to fund your general fund for those first 6 months, you could be very cash poor and not be able to advance that project and pay the invoices on that project during that time because your cash is being used to float the general fund for that period.
Particularly if you have a contractual payment schedule that you need to meet, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so the idea of maintaining a floor of reserves defined as the working capital reserves for the general fund protects the other fund's ability to be able to fund their projects at any time during the year. So we don't have to worry about cash flow issues during those first 6 months. So that's layer one of your general fund reserves. Your next layer is your operating reserves. So it represents about 15% of your revenues. And that is the stuff has hit the fan economically, and we have suffered specific revenue losses as a result. And we need to actually fund portions of the general fund activity until we can reorganize and make the tough decisions to balance the budget. Yeah. This is not intended to float the general fund until things get well.
This is the rainy day fund. Cassandra, this is the contingency that you referenced.
Correct. Yeah. So this is your layer of contingency. So this is the funds that will kick in and actually balance the general fund and give us time to actually sort through to see, because we're going to have to fix it if it's a long-term sustainable loss, like what we experienced in the 2008-2009 timeframe as the housing bubble bursted. That was a long 10-year sustained loss of revenue. A reserve like this is not going to float you till things get better, But what it will do is it'll float you until you can actually adequately react without it being an emergency. And so now you have time to actually right size the organization. You have time to reorganize your structure. You have time and adequate reserves to help those some folks move along if it's time for golden parachutes and whatever the case may be, to make sure that it's not an emergency and we're not putting people on the street in an emergency fashion. We have some cash to handle it appropriately and with due diligence. Then the third layer of the general fund reserves would be your opportunity/emergency response reserves. So the best example of this category is what we're going through right now with COVID. And so we have, and at the direction of your mayor, who has, and the rest of the council, who have quickly responded to COVID by establishing all of and one example is the vaccination clinics, the field hospital, all the money that we put forth out for the restaurant rescue program, all of those things where we needed cash to be able to respond and act quickly. This 5% reserve will be used for those purposes. Now, the good news is it's the use of these funds should be measured, right? So the ability to be reimbursed at a later date by FEMA, or in our case, by the CARES Act money that has trickled down to us, or the relief bill that was just recently, the $1.9 trillion that was recently approved by Congress, that's going to flow money down to us. That is the money that is going to come later to help replenish these activities and replenish this reserve. So ideally, we would be using them on activities that we know that there's a good chance of being reimbursed, but it gives us that working capital and the cash to be able to react quickly and be able to actually perform those responsibilities in the street as soon as possible. We had a lot of businesses that benefited from that, our ability to actually have reserves and be able to react quickly, especially the car buying program is one. I see Mr. Yeager's face popping back into the screen. That was one program where we needed to advance cash pretty quickly. And the other one is the restaurant program that we actually have going on right now. Other reserves for the internal service funds are actuarially defined. The need is actuarially defined through our self-insurance program, as with our general liability activities. Our general liability is our insurance litigation program that we have, and the amount of cash that we have on hand to continue to call ourselves self-insured is a specific number that's actuarially defined. And so that number, when we have our actuary done every 2 years, they give us that number, and that's what's going to actually equate to the amount that we put into reserves there. Then on fleet maintenance and information technology, those are just emergency reserves needed for those activities so that we can keep cars rolling and we can keep the technology going on the IT side. The last reserve category is that for Lancaster Choice Energy. So we have recently been they let us know that we want to actually have a strong reserve, a strong fund balance position to be able to acquire power in the market at the best rates. And so, or to be able to take advantage of the best offerings of power as it's being sold, and having a well-established reserve in that fund to help enhance our credibility in that light will help us gain access to the best available power in the market for our customers. And so the idea is that we establish a reserve that represents about 25% of the operating cost of the power purchases that we need to make on an annual basis. That's about $10 million. The idea here is that we start with significant intent on establishing that reserve with the base contribution from the general fund to the LCE in the amount of about $2 million. So this is how it would break down. We're expecting our general fund reserves at year end this year to be about 33 million. The breakdown of how we intend to allocate through all the categories I just described works out to be not by magic. It just happened when we actually broke down and calculated each category. It actually worked out to be $32.9 million. And so the point here is that we can actually take the existing reserves that we have and accomplish all of these reserve goals without the need of a direct allocation from Measure LC revenues going into the next cycle. we can't handle that. So as we talk about that Maslow's hierarchy, and we'll revisit that here at the end of the presentation, as we talk about that Maslow's hierarchy of need, that bottom tier of that triangle can actually be satisfied with funds that we currently have on hand. There is a question about the city's debt. And so without getting into any debt for our old redevelopment agency, successor agency debt, this is a lot of the active debt that is being funded through current activities. We have Section 108 loans. Section 108 loans are loans that are allowed through HUD. They allow you to advance future HUD allocations and finance them over a period of time. So in 2015, we refinanced a couple of transactions that were out there, but there are the two deals that are still hanging out there, where the allocation that we get from HUD on an annual basis funds the debt service payments on these Section 108 loans. That's basically HUD money. HUD let us borrow money in advance of them sending money in the future, and there's the interest cost. So there's a little bit of a mark up if we were to just waited. So because we're paying interest on the advance, but nevertheless, it's still HUD money coming in to pay for those. That is not a general fund obligation. Then we have a variety of capital leases for vehicles to copier machines and the like that are hanging out there. We have one loan with the State Commission, State Energy and Resource Commission that's almost paid off. We have a financing that we did with California Edison to buy all of our street lights, our street light acquisition financing that we did in 2016. Then we have our public improvement project financing. Those are lease obligation bonds in 2018. That's a general fund obligation. That's the money that's going to be used for the City Hall rehab and some other projects around City Hall. Then we have a solar renewable energy revenue bonds that were issued in 2012. And then we have just our Measure R and Measure M financing that was done just last year. And we owe still $46 million on that transaction. Any questions on these before we leave?
What about your successor agency debt? The former
successor agency redevelopment debt is another slate of deals that I can send to you. Really, that the successor agency still has tax increment that comes in, pays for it, and as that debt gets paid off, it flows to the taxing entities. So think about it. We get 100% of the tax increment money in those project areas to pay for the debt. Once the debt is paid off, that money that was in those that we receive in tax increment in those areas then have to flow to our taxing entities. So all the taxing entities, which includes the school district, the college, a variety of county organizations, we would receive about 7 cents on the dollar once the obligations are fully satisfied on a go-forward basis.
Yeah. And to clarify, that is no longer clarified. I may be wrong, George. There's no longer a debt of the city. It's through the successor agency. And Jim, you were on that commission. Those are no longer held as debts of the city. They're debts of the successor agency, which is now in county hands.
That is correct. And that's why if you were actually to look at our financials, you would not see that debt listed under the city of Lancaster. It is a debt of the successor agency, which has been consolidated with the county. Yep.
So that's managed by the 5-member oversight board under the auspices of the county then.
That's correct. All right. There was a question at our last meeting regarding pension liabilities and OPEB. How many are you familiar with the term OPEB? That's one of those very municipal finance 4-letter words that come up. But OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. OPEB is basically retiree medical. It is an obligation that cities have to pay for their defined benefit retiree medical. But starting at the top of this list, we have CalPERS. City responsibly two-tiered their CalPERS before 2012 was the deadline in order to do that. In 2012, statewide, the legislature approved the Public Employee Pension Reform Act, commonly known as PEPRA, which on a go-forward basis from January 1st of 2012 and on, all employees hired by a government entity had a new selection of plans that they can choose that were significantly more affordable than the plans that were offered to employees prior to January 1st of 2012. The next slide, I'll actually show you what that means. In advance of that, the city of Lancaster adopted a second tier for those employees that were hired after a time specific that was less fruitful than the original classic plan. So we have these classifications of people. So people that were hired prior to government and to local government prior to January 2012, they're considered classic members. People that were hired after are considered PEPRA members. So they're the ones that are subject to the new retirement plans. All of this was done in an effort to reduce statewide unfunded liability that was just eating up tax dollars from statewide basis. And so the city of Lancaster, in advance of the PEPRA employees, also wanted to treat their classic employees in a more affordable manner. So they created a second tier for classics. And so if you think about it, there is a class of employees that were hired before a particular date that have one set of retirement plans. Then you have your classic employees like myself, who were in government prior to January of 2012. So I'm eligible for a classic consideration, but because I got hired by the city of Lancaster after their second day or their specific date for tier 2, I get a tier 2 benefit. And then everybody hired into government after 12, regardless if it's Lancaster or not, they get hired on the third tier. And I'll explain those tiers on the next slide. But to be eligible for CalPERS, I'm sorry?
Pensions in America. You pretty much just laid out what pensions are in America today. That same school of thought you just described, I could put it at any large company in this country right now. It's that tier method. So yeah. So in private industry, they actually got out of pensions altogether and went to defined contribution 401k plans. But unless you're gonna go like me, their grandfather, I've got like 3 or 4 different plans that add up to one. So legacy, yeah. So there's different. It's similar to some of these things. That's exactly right.
And it all came about just to make things more affordable, which is at the end of the day, that's the goal here for all the tiering. Right. CalPERS is a very small plan that's still hanging out there, and then OPEB is the post-employment benefit program, which is a closed program. The city of Lancaster closed that plan January 1, 2016, and converted everybody to a defined contribution plan, whereby the city gives them a fixed amount of money. They invested in their medical savings plan. It's invested on behalf of the employee, and then whatever amount that grows to, based on market conditions between the time that it's invested and the time the employee needs it at retirement, is what they have, as opposed to guaranteeing in a defined benefit program, guaranteeing that regardless of the performance of the investments along the way, guaranteeing them a fixed amount at retirement based on a formula, which becomes a gamble, right? So depending on how the market performs, the city is left on the hook for the defined benefit plans. On a defined contribution, it puts in a lump sum amount, that money grows, and whatever it grows to, that's what the employee gets, as opposed to a fixed amount of guaranteed money. So going to the CalPERS program, these are those 3 tiers. We don't have safety employees with the city of Lancaster. We're all considered miscellaneous. For a city that has police and fire, or police or fire, they would have safety employees, and those safety employees have their own set of benefit formulas that try to get them retired in between 50 and 55. The idea for the classic members is that you would retire at 55 or better, and better is older, not better is younger. So you retire at 55 or better. So those classic members that were hired prior to January 2013, you have the 2.7 at 55 formula. Does anybody need me to explain how that works? So in essence, you would get, at the age of 55, your pension would be equal to 2.7% for every year of service that you put in. So if you put in 30 years of service, at the age of 55, your pension would be 2.7% times 30 years. And that's how they calculate your plan for you, or your actual benefit. The tier 2, which is what I'm in for my years of service at Lancaster, I would get 2% at the age of 60 for the years of service, for every year of service. Now, it's only for my years of service at Lancaster. So because I spent years of service at other cities, those years are calculated at their plan years, at their plan formula. So my 2 at 60 years are just for the years that are calculated here at the city of Lancaster. And then you have, for those employees that were hired, that are PEPRA employees, I'm sorry, did I say 2012? The trigger is 2013, I apologize. For the PEPRA employees, it's 2% at 62. So for somebody to receive full formula of 2% for every year of service, they'd have to wait to age 62 for the current plan. For those folks hired after January 1st, 2013, that had no government service prior to that. So the big question that nobody really answers in the press, but they talk about it quite a bit: unfunded liability. So what is there was a while when this was a very popular topic, and it still is, that finance directors would go to the finance directors conference and we would be identified by our unfunded liability. So you need to sit over there with your $100 million unfunded liability, and you need to sit over there with your $50 million unfunded liability. And it was such a bad word in the environment that we work in, that we were all being categorized by it. City of Lancaster, respectively so, does not have a significant unfunded liability as a lot of cities do. Right now, our planned liability, as actuarially calculated, is $185 million, and that is to satisfy all of the employees in all of the tiers, right? That's not specific to any tier. That's our entire program aggregated. We have $127 million with CalPERS. So every payday, we send money to CalPERS on behalf of each employee based on the amount or the formulas there, and I'll explain that in a second. And so we owe, currently as we sit, our planned liability is 185. We have 127 million with CalPERS to help pay for that. So it leaves a unfunded amount of 58 million. You see that on that bottom line. And so if anybody were to ask, now that you're involved in the committee, what is the city of Lancaster's unfunded liability? It is $58 million. Now, CalPERS has a plan. So their plan started in 2014, 15. They started calculating the actuarial effects of actually having every single city or every single client of theirs, whether that be a city, special district, or whomever, actually work to pay off that unfunded liability within a period of 20 years. So built into our actuarial and our payment calculation, there is a payment that we pay every year against that 58 million that is amortized over a period of 20 years to have that paid off then. And there's an expectation that at the end of those 20 years, and combined with that payment schedule and the addition of new employees into the PEPRA group of employees, the idea is after this 20 years, and we are 4 to 5 years into that, the unfunded liability problem in the state of California will be next to gone. Our payment that we make towards that is listed under that unfunded liability payment, the $3.1 million. So that is our payment in this current year that we have paid to, or I'm sorry, this was last year, that we paid towards our $58 million pension liability.
It's over above the 11%.
No. The 11% is something different. So I'll explain what that 11% is in a second. That's basically there for informational purpose. So the normal cost is, you're correct. So that is above the 11% that that we pay on a payroll basis. So on every paycheck, the employee pays 8% out of their check if they're a tier 1 employee. If they're tier 2, they pay 7%. If they're tier 3, they pay 6.25%. Because that comes out of the employee's check. The city then kicks in the normal cost. The normal cost is calculated at the 11.144. So that is considered our normal cost. So if there was no debt, if the plan liability equaled the plan net position, the assets, and there was no net pension liability, our cost would be equal to 11.1% of payroll every year to continue to sustain the program. That makes sense? And also taking into account that the employees pay their share.
I got it. Thanks.
Okay, so that is City of Lancaster pension or PERS description in 5 minutes. Makes sense? Clear as mud? There's so much, many more layers to that if you do have questions, I would love to have a one-on-one conversation and bore you to death.
So the way the state is assessing your net pension liability, there must be a carrying cost in there on top of the 20-year mathematical calculation, yeah?
Well, this is
yes,
kind of...
No, they're right. To answer your question, yeah. So the net pension liability is assumed based on that 7.15% discount rate. So that's the carrying cost. And so what they're saying is they assume that their portfolio is going to make 7.15% minimum every year to sustain these numbers. Every year that they do not, as CalPERS investment portfolio managers, if they do not hit that 7.15% return, that plan liability number goes up to accommodate still needing to make those obligations.
I don't know what they're smoking up there, but I don't know who's getting 7.15% on an investment. To be clear, this last year, CalPERS did like 6.5%. The years prior to that, they did 8%. They did 9%. It's an equity investment portfolio. My personal plan did 15% last year, right? And so CalPERS has the benefit, unlike cities do, that they can actually invest the funds of the pension program in a more aggressive stance. The problem is when they get it wrong, we have to pay more. When they get it right, we pay less. And so it's the gamble that we take to be part of the program. And so the lag time of a bad performing year is 2 years. So the fiscal year that just ended on June 30th, where I think their end of the year performance was six and some change, that's going to equate to an actual adjustment on our amortization schedules of liability, and it's going to be a net increase to our plan liability. Plan assets will remain the same, right? Because the amount of money we have with them is the amount of money we have with them. So what happens to our net pension liability when the plan liability goes up because that 1 year they did not hit their mark from an investment standpoint? So is there any thought about capitalizing the 58 million shortfall for a lesser cost than 7.15%?
Well, the only reason you would do that is if you can take that money and invest it and do better than the 7.15%. Right? So what a lot of cities have been doing is they pay that down, they pay off that pension liability, and they give it to CalPERS. And then CalPERS has another year where it does 6.5%. And so your pool of money that you thought you had with CalPERS just suffered a loss. City of Richmond was probably the worst example of that. They issued pension obligation bonds, went out and got $80 million in debt or whatever the number was, turned around and gave that money to CalPERS to wipe out their unfunded liability. CalPERS follows with the worst investment performance year in history. And so City of Richmond's, their payment goes up because now they have a new created unfunded liability, and they now also have debt service on the bonds that they sold. So they kind of spiraled on them. And so there's a lot of different strategies. I think the best strategy is to do what the city of Lancaster did, is find a way to lower the cost. Try to find a way to lower your overall pension cost. So what they did by implementing that second tier, and by nature of PEPRA doing what it's doing and adding that third tier, Lancaster lowered the cost of their pension obligation.
Yeah. Now I would add too, Jim, that there's an opportunity to fund what they call trust funds, and I don't know there's a number for it, but where instead of giving those funds to PERS, right? If we wanted to spend more money to remove that obligation or to lower that unfunded liability, you put that in a trust fund in which you may manage it, but it also offsets your liability when you do the actuarial analysis at the audit. So you can lower your net liability, but you don't give it away to PERS to lose, right? And there are investment strategies in which you do that. So you're managing your own money in this portfolio in what they call a trust fund. What's the name of the trust fund? It's a Section 104 trust fund or something.
Correct.
It almost sounds like 401ks almost.
No, it's still an investment fund that you're creating, but it's to fund a defined benefit program.
Okay.
So the cost of your overall cost is still actuarially defined based on this obligation that you have at the end of the day to your employees. A 401k plan is such that you give them a fixed amount, it invests, and whatever it ends up being at the time of their retirement, that's what it is, and the city accepts no risk. It accepts no obligation risk to actually perform, to be able to provide a fixed promise at the end of the year.
But I meant with regard to Jason saying letting the employee manage their own investments.
No.
No.
His recommendation is that the city would still manage it. The city would manage it.
It's to be a city sequestered trust fund for this purpose, then it offsets your liability. You don't give it to PERS.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like there's got to be a better way than giving it to PERS.
Yeah.
Right.
So that strategy is that you try to get a fair rate on your debt. So if you were to issue $58 million worth of public debt, and you get charged 4.5% for that debt is now costing you less than the 7.15% that CalPERS is charging you on their discount rate. And so that spread you can use to actually help to pay off the debt faster if you want to make a fixed payment, as if PERS was still charging you, just like you would on your mortgage. Try to advance the payments on your mortgage when you do a refi, or you keep the difference and spend it in some other way. But yeah, there's a lot of different strategies out there, but ultimately the best strategy is kind of what we've already done: try to lower the cost by having more affordable programs.
Very good. Thank you.
The CalPERS program, not a lot there. There's 72 remaining members. A lot of them are no longer with us, with the city, but there's a planned liability about almost $12 million. We have $9 million in the bank for it. And so we're making payments on that $3 million to make sure that we can sustain that benefit for those employees as an obligation. And then getting into the OPEB side. So OPEB, once again, this plan is closed off. No new employees can participate in a defined benefit medical retiree program with the city. But there are still 349 members that's being funded in this program for a total of $27 million in liability to those folks. There's $10 million in the account, which leaves a net pension liability, or I'm sorry, that's not net obligation. That's a typo in that chart. Net obligation is $17 million. That's still unfunded. So that is our unfunded OPEB liability. If anybody were to ask you, we make payments about $1.8 million towards that $17 million on an annual basis as a result of trying to be optimistic, cautiously optimistic with the budget this year. We did not make the liability payment. We just paid the pay-as-you-go costs, the actual benefits out to the employees in this current fiscal year to balance the budget and be responsible. But we'll look at that in the future.
And I'm gonna have to cut out right now. I've got an event with the mayor at 6:30, but you're in good hands with George. And thank you guys for your time and service. So we'll see you next month.
Be safe.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you, Jason. All right, so there's a question about budget process. These last 2 slides are to discuss just that. Really the budget process, and I'll start with the statement that I make there at the bottom of the screen. So putting the document together for the next year takes us about 4 months because there's a lot of detail in that document. If you ever look at our 100-page budget document, you'll see there's a lot of detail, there's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of cross-referencing, there's a lot of work that's done on the back end, but it does take 4 months or so to go through the research, to go through the input and so forth to get that document together for council's adoption in June. But the budget is managed over a 12-month period. The budget, as you're managing your budget, it is constantly being reviewed, constantly being updated. With any council meeting, the budget can be amended to appropriate for a new project or to recognize unexpected revenues as they come in. And then we do a major budget review at mid-year in the January, February timeframe. So I like to say the budget is a 4-month process, but it takes 4 months to put that book together, and all in it. But that budget is managed every single month, year round. But looking at the quick schedule of March, as March concludes today, we've already done a lot of these activities, budget meetings with the departments that began. We've set up account numbers in the accounting structure for new and gotten rid of them for old programs. Departments, we start looking at their expenditure estimates for continued programming of stuff that they will continue to do into next year. We haven't quite talked about anything new yet that is done in the April timeframe. Any personnel requests, deletions, additions, conversions, they're done in April. We do our central allocation, cost allocation in April. And then this is where Jason and I are going to spend quite a bit of time over the next month, kind of talk about what's new, what's going in, what's old, what's coming out, what are we doing this year that we didn't do last year, and what did we do last year that we're not going to continue into next year. So that's when we start having that. I call it my cutting room floor meetings, because the departments may put in some requests that may not get well. And so this is where Jason and I sit in, and before we make a recommendation to the council, we take the considerations of this committee as well as the department heads, and we put that into the document, into a final package that's balanced and delivered to council in June. The idea is that we'll get in front of you again at the end of April. It sounds like you all had a chance to meet with Diane or communicate with Diane that the 4th Wednesday in April works for you. So that'll be our chance to go over some budget propositions for the use of Measure LC and some bigger picture items too that will give you to maintain in consideration of the use of Measure LC dollars. And then if necessary, if we need to recircle those wagons back to the commission, we will reserve some time in May to meet again before we actually advance the budget proposal to the council in June. And then in February, we review everything again. So in June, we set the budget for the next year that starts July 1. We perform and actually run the city for the 6 months, and then we go back and revisit all the budget numbers again in January after a 6-month review, and we make adjustments if needed. This year, that was a very important step as the all of our sales tax estimates for the year, because of COVID, they were all significantly reduced by our consultant. And by the time we got back together and reviewed the numbers again in January, it actually, the reality was an outperformance of those estimates that the consultant gave to the tune of about $3 million for this fiscal year in sales tax alone. So they had us reduce our budget $3 million. We ended up putting that $3 million back in as an expectation come mid-year. So that mid-year review is very important. And then what is the basis? So I put this together because it seems intuitive to my staff, just because it's just what we do. We need to provide an estimate to what stuff costs so we can put it in the budget. But every expenditure category has a different methodology for coming up with that number. Some numbers it's easy. If I have a contract with someone, or if the city has a contract with someone and the contract costs X, and we know we have to spend X, that's very easy. I can look at the contract, put that number in, and plan to spend that money, that precise X. But then there's other things like the gas bill or the power bill. Believe it or not, The power bill is a big bill for the city. We have to pay for every street light. We have to pay for every water pump. We have to pay for every, our power bill is very expensive. The sprinkler systems at the parks, our water bill is very expensive. So it's not something you want to woefully get wrong, if that makes sense. You don't want to misinterpret or misestimate your utility costs, because they're into the millions and millions of dollars. And so this is the phase of the process where we actually will implement a lot of these estimating tools and resources to try to come up with the best numbers that we can. For revenues, we really do look at trend analysis. We have consultant input, like we have our HDL consultant that gives us an estimate of what our sales tax and property tax is going to do. We have trend analysis for like our TOT tax. We kind of look at what we've done historically over the years and try to plug a number that we think makes sense. For COVID, we discounted that number a bit because we anticipated there'd be just a lot less travel as a result of COVID. Came to find out that number outperformed what our discount was. And then we have, for like our special revenues, we have third-party input. The county of San Bernardino, I'm sorry, I'm dating myself back to when I worked for Victorville. The county of LA will actually tell us what we should expect to receive in a lot of those categories. They're going to tell us at budget time what we should expect to receive in Measure R, in our Measure R allocation, our Measure M allocation. They give us very, very specific numbers. We plug those very, very specific numbers. And then they tell us that number's wrong about 3 months later, and we adjust the number to what the new number is. Because once again, that's all based on how much money is being sold at that point of sale location, and it's all an estimate. But we do like to rely on those partners, on those community partners, and those other government agencies to give us their best estimate of what we're going to get. Personnel costs based on actuals. We're going to budget that 240 FTEs at specific salaries, at specific benefit costs, at specific amounts that we know we're going to pay to CalPERS on their behalf, and that very, very specific number is what's put into the budget. So those are the easiest to estimate. Contract costs based on actuals. If we have a contract and the contract's for $100, we're going to put in a budget. We're going to pay X company $100. So it's very easy to put that information in the budget. Utility costs I talked about a little bit earlier. We will call the provider. We will call California Edison. We will call the gas company. We will call the water company and try to figure out if they have any planned rate increases for the year, so that we can use to implement and estimate what our costs are going to be. Debt service, as we talked, those are fixed debt schedules. Those are easy. So we just plan whatever the next year's payment is, just like on your mortgage. Whatever that next year's payment is, that's what we plug right into the budget. And then the capital costs are all based on contract bid awards and engineers' estimates for those contracts or those projects that have not yet been bid out, but are going to take place in the year. We'll use the engineers' estimates. So this is a repeat of Jason's Maslow's hierarchy of needs triangle that we shared last week. So as we move forward with the budget production, looking at those sound fiscal foundation and resilience. So we talked a little bit about those reserves today. We believe we're in a really good place at that layer of the triangle. Then we're going to get into city infrastructure. That's going to be the next phase. Trelease is going to be the expert in that regards as the assistant city manager / former city engineer. He'll be able to actually help us with that layer of it. Public safety, as we talked about, public safety is not just the hybrid policing model. There's some other elements of code enforcement and some other things that are involved in public safety. But the hybrid policing model is something you'll probably hear the most about as we progress towards the budget adoption. Economic development, that is, once again, investing money to help make money later. So that is an opportunity, those are opportunities that we create by utilizing city resources to try to stimulate economic development down lines, and basically turning those dollars in the community to generate actually sales tax benefits later. And then new facilities, programs, and services. That is just the new, until you can satisfy those first four layers, it would be very difficult to talk about creating new programming or new services or new facilities, new parks and whatnot. We got to take care of what we got before we can actually move on to build new. So with that, we have this cool little diagram with the new logo on it. I think it's going to fill it with color. There we go. There's the color. Nice. So with that kind of concludes the presentation. I'm available to answer any questions you may have. But this is not the end of my availability to answer any questions you may have. So if you do have something that comes into mind after we meet, just shoot myself and Diane a question via email, and we'll work and get you an answer back out. Or if there's any particular documents you want to see, I'll be sure that when the financials that come out next month for the last fiscal year, as they come out, I'll send you our consolidated annual financial report, so you can review that and have that available for reference. It's a very, very stimulating document that if you have a need to read something that's gonna really get those sheep bouncing at night, if you want to go to sleep, I recommend diving into that consolidated annual financial report for your nighttime reading.
You make the assumption that money bores some of us. This is my core competency is finance, so
okay.
Bore me. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Then we should be talking, because it's hard for me to find people that want to listen to me speak. Even my wife tunes me out.
Yeah, I do it at a different level from an aerospace perspective and larger, pots of money, but different colors of money as they call. So yeah, I enjoy the conversation. So.
Oh, well, then I appreciate you enjoying the conversation. I look forward to the many more that we'll have, because I can't find many people that want to.
Jim does too. Jim's he's a fellow nerd on money, so yeah. I could tell
by his questions. I could tell he's very much involved. So this is going to be a great experience, I think, for us all. So with that, unless you have any further questions, that will conclude my presentation.
Excellent presentation. I don't know, Jeff or Chris, if you have any questions or comments?
No, sir, I'm good.
Very thorough. It's very thorough.
Thank you. All right, well, that would conclude my presentation.
All right, thank you very much. We do have the agenda items to go over, I should say. Okay, let me get this to where we're at. Got to pull up the agenda here. Okay. We only have one agenda item. However, we would need now to ask for public input, if there is any. Ms. Dush, could you announce that, please?
At this time, anyone wishing to comment on CC1, please press *9. I will announce the last 4 digits of your call-in number when it is your turn to speak. Please state your name and eliminate any background noise. Individual speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. Please press *9 at this time. We have no callers.
All right, thank you. All right, then the next item is an action item, which is our consent calendar, which is the consideration and approval of minutes of our first meeting of March 24th. I appreciate a motion, please.
I move to approve the minutes from the March 24th meeting.
I second.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, then, moved and seconded. Any further comments from anyone? Please call the roll.
Committee Member Yeager.
Here.
Committee Member Harvey.
Yes.
Vice Chair Sison.
Here.
Chair Vos.
Yes, thank you. So it passes 4-0 with 1 member absent. Thank you. All right, then that brings us to any other updates or comments that staff would care to share with us?
None further.
None? All right, thank you. Ms. Dosh shared our contact information with all of us, so we all know how to get in touch with one another if we choose to. I just want to thank everyone for participating tonight and our last meeting as well, and particularly Mr. Harris, an outstanding briefing, I must say. That's the clearest presentation that I've had in on budgeting process in my career with public agencies. Outstanding, and we're blessed to have you on board.
Oh, thank you. Can you tell Jason that? He's been trying to shake me. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, I thank you for the comments, and I'm glad to be here with the city.
Very good. All right then, members, anyone care to add anything before we adjourn?
Do we have a schedule? Did we decide on when the next meeting was going to be? Is it next?
I think it's the 28th of April, the last Thursday.
Okay. Or last Wednesday, or?
Yeah, the last Wednesday.
Yeah, last Wednesday.
Yeah, I'm sorry, 29th. The 28th, the last Wednesday, not Thursday, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do believe that so it's the last Wednesday because there's an issue with the third Wednesday conflicting with the Social Equity Committee.
Right. Okay.
Yes, 28th, right.
4th. Mm-hmm.
That'll work.
All right, works for everybody.
All right.
All right, is that good for everyone?
Yes, thank you.
Cassie, you gonna be good with that? It's on your, already there, huh? All right. Good. Okay, then, let's see, no further announcements then. Any further comments from the members? No? All right. So we'll stand adjourned then. Oh, wait a minute. We do have to ask for public comments at the end of our meeting. So Ms. Dosh, would you announce that, please?
At this time, anyone wishing to comment on non-agendized items, please press *9. I will announce the last 4 digits of your call-in number when it is your turn to speak. Please state your name and eliminate any background noise. Individual speakers are limited to 3 minutes each. State law prohibits the committee from taking action on any items not listed on the agenda. Please press *9 at this time. And there are no callers.
All right, thank you. All right, then we'll stand adjourned. Before I do, if anyone would like to volunteer to offer the invocation at our next meeting, please let me know. And all right, appreciate that from anyone. So we'll stand adjourned to our next meeting, which would be Wednesday, April 28th, 2021 at 5 p.m. And I'm assuming it's still going to be a Zoom meeting. So appreciate your comments and interaction this evening. Thank you all. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you. You as well.
Likewise. Yes.
Thanks, George.
All right.
Thank
You're welcome.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.